Let's look at an original Italian bill. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So I'm here at Woolley & Wallace in Salisbury, looking at some of the items for their upcoming auction on the 27th and 28th of November. The catalogue's linked down below in the description. Now what we've got here is an Italian bill. Quite difficult to date these. They're usually dated as 16th century. However, this particular style of bill does start to appear in the 15th century, but certain details of it, of the particular sort of decorational details, probably put this into the 16th century. So this is the sort of thing that was around, known as a ronca at the time of Achille Marozzo in 1536, and he has a bunch of techniques in there for how to use these. Now, I'm going to gingerly remove this from the shaft. The shaft is later and was made for display purposes, and thankfully, and it's easier to film with, the head pops off. So, the provenance for this is quite interesting. So first thing to say is a lot of these were made in the 19th century to decorate mansion walls and castles and stuff. However, I'm pretty sure that this is a spot-on original, and moreover, it was found, archaeologically you could say, it came out of a sort of cliffside bank on the Isle of Wight, which is, if you don't know the United Kingdom, is a little island just off the south coast. Not that far from where I live, actually. I can drive to the Isle of Wight. Well, I'd have to get a ferry to get there, of course. So it's a little island, and it's got some interesting fortifications on it. It played an interesting role around the time of the Spanish Armada and Henry VIII's period. So it's an interesting historical place to visit if you're ever in the UK. But this bill is of an Italian type. How do I know that? Well, essentially there are two main countries that loved the bill. The bill defined by having a hook and a spike and a spike. Okay, so hook, spear point at the end, spike at the back. We've got additional spikes here and we'll talk about those in a minute. And the bill, or ronca, as the Italians would generally call it, I believe. Sometimes these can be described as gisam in French or fauchard, but there's some debate around what those terms exactly apply to, because they can apply potentially to other polearms as well, or hafted weapons if you prefer. But there are essentially two main families of bill. The bill obviously originally derives from an agricultural implement, a sickle or a scythe put on a long pole. So in the old days of, let's say, the 12th or 13th century, you go and raise your levies and you tell them you've got to do military service because the French are invading or whoever, and they go and get their agricultural tools, they cobble something together, and then they serve in war. But over time, obviously, they evolved into more specialized military weapons. Now, the two main families of bill are the English bill and the Italian bill, and that's because in England the bill was the standard kind of pole weapon of choice for war. Okay, from the kind of late 14th, early 15th century all the way through to the Tudor period. And I've done some videos talking about the expression billman. Now, a lot of people use the expression billman in reference to the Wars of the Roses. In fact, it seems like at that period the term billman wasn't really in use, or it certainly wasn't in widespread use, and billman actually is something more of the Tudor period. So the majority of billmen and bills that we know about are from Henry VIII's time fundamentally, and later. So by the time we get into the 1500s, the English are using the bill pretty much alongside the pike as their standard pole weapon. In the same way that the Germans liked halberds, the French liked glaives, the Swiss liked pikes, as well as halberds, and so on and so forth. So different nations liked different shafted weapons. The English loved the bill, and the Italians loved the bill as well. Now, the Italians also had partisans and spiedo, different types of spear, corset, and so on, as well as pikes. Everybody pretty much had pikes. But in Italy, the bill was very popular. In England, the bill was popular, but they don't look the same. And this shape, this slender shape with a long hook that comes semicircle, almost like a crescent moon, is a typical Italian shape. The English shape of bill As featured on finds from the Mary Rose, for example, and the surviving examples in various collections today, is more similar to a halberd actually. It's a much broader chopping blade, less of a long hook, more of just a curved forward chopping edge, and usually a relatively shorter but wider spike. So in essence, following all the cliches, the English one is a little bit cruder, a little bit more kind of hitty, and the Italian one is a bit more slender, a bit more elegant, and I have to say they're usually more refined in their manufacturer as well, because Italian armories were more established, they were bigger, they had more staff in general, and they were exporting weapons all over Europe. So Italian bills find themselves all over the place, and despite the fact there is an English style of bill, the Italian bills, we know from records, were imported in large numbers into London from Italian armourers and via armourers on the continent, like in Flanders, for example. So, an Italian bill of absolutely classic shape, long point. Now, the long point is an interesting thing to mention. So if you look there, you can see it looks very slender this direction, but if I turn it there, you can see it is thick. So this is square section. This is like the end of a rapier blade, okay? So this is designed to penetrate through armor, certainly through mail and through padded jacks and things like this, but also gaps in plate armor, but it has to be thick in order to be strong, okay? So it's got a reinforced, and if I just show here, you can just see how it steps up. So we've got a flat blade here, and then it steps up to square section just up here. Reinforced tip. The blade is edged front and back. So this hook, I think a lot of people assume that these are only edged on the inside like a sickle. They're actually edged on the front and the back. And we know from the treatises that they are used for cutting and pushing this way as well as hooking this way, and I think people often forget that. So if you're against an opposing pole weapon, like a pike for example, you can push it down to the ground with the front element there, and that will chop into the wood, which assists you in getting a bind on the weapon and driving it down into the ground. Equally, if you're just thrusting at someone and the point misses, then at least you will hit them with that edge there that's a bit like an axe blade on the outside, but thinner than an axe blade, more like a knife blade actually. So, edged front and back, and then this is edged all the way around here, so you can also chop with this thing, and it has that raised point here to have more effect when chopping, a little bit like a bill hook chopper or a halberd blade. So having that focus of the energy helps to chop through things, of course. On the back we've got a spike that serves a couple of purposes, obviously hitting with it to penetrate things, a bit like a pick or a warhammer. But it also gives you another element that you can cross against someone's weapon. So if someone chops down with their halberd or bill or partisan at you, you can block with that. And that is almost certainly why we end up with these little thickened and notch elements up here, because a weapon sliding down here is likely to get caught in here. So this does to some extent act a little bit like a crossguard on a sword, or one of those spikes on the side of a two-handed, sort of like a Zweihander or Montante. This is also edged down here, so this is edged, this is blunt. Very little is likely to hit between these 2 points here, but a lot of things could hit there. So even if you chopped with that part of the blade, that is also edged. So we've got a point, edge, 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 all the way down there. This bit's blunt, point and point. Now, these lower points, I'll talk about the socket in a second, but there should be another point on the other side here. Interestingly, this one's been removed. So these little, whether you call them points or parrying lugs, whichever you prefer, you'll notice there is a forged element here where there was, and there usually is, another spike on the other side. So usually you have a spike on each side. Now, interestingly, this one is missing. So that actually, to me, kind of lends credence to its genuineness as a real piece that's served and been looked after and adapted. Probably what happened is, for some reason, this spike on this side got damaged or broken, and so they decided to just smooth off. But it's nice because no one would make it deliberately like that. It's very clearly part of its life and part of its story. That it originally had a point here that for some reason got removed, either deliberately or, well, it certainly got smoothed off deliberately, but maybe it got broken off accidentally. Right, finally, the socket. So you'll notice that the socket is wider in this direction than in this direction. That is because with any chopping pole weapon like a halberd or indeed a bill, you really want to be able to feel the edge alignment. If you just put a round handle on it, and I have to say the replacement handle is actually kind of flat actually, that's not bad. But very often you find replacement grips are cylindrical. The problem with having a cylindrical grip is you can't feel which direction your hook or your edge is pointing in. So usually this flattened section to the socket would follow through into the shaft, and the shaft would be flattened, usually octagonal, essentially like a rectangle but with the corners beveled off to make it more comfortable to hold. And that enables you to feel the direction that the edge is in when you give a big chop. This would have had languettes, and in fact you can see the remainder of the languettes. If we look just here, you can see the languette, as very often is the case, is broken off. So this has a front languette at the front. Now the languettes serve two purposes. One is to prevent the enemy weapons from chopping into the wooden shaft of your weapon, but the other very important and often overlooked reason to have a languette is to increase the contact surface between the head and the shaft. There is a lot of leverage. If you were hitting something up here and you've got a long shaft and you're holding it down there somewhere, there is a lot of braking force here. So having the languettes coming down the shaft really massively increases the strength of the whole weapon. And when we're using poleaxes, for example, in armoured fighting, often the poleaxe head breaks off the shaft at the point where they connect. So it's really important to have these languettes. And to protect the wood from being cut through as well by opposing bills or swords or whatever. So those languettes are broken off with the shaft. So if this went into a cliff face, into the ground, in the Isle of Wight, let's say in the 16th century, we can imagine, because it's been adapted down here, this bill had probably been in use for a few, at least a few years, possibly decades, before it went into the ground and got forgotten about. Probably the shaft got snapped off it in the ground, perhaps through ploughing or whatever, erosion of the cliff face. And when that shaft broke off, it took the languettes with it, and they'll be somewhere in the ground rusting away by themselves. And we're left with this head, but what an amazing survival. Really interesting piece. Really, really cool. Dates to probably the early 1500s would be my estimate, maybe 1520 to 1550. So first half of the 16th century, I would say, but a really, really nice piece. And I hope it's been interesting for you to see it. So check out the full catalogue for William Wallace down below, auction on 27th and 28th of November 2024. And if you've got any specific questions, things you'd like me to add or look into about bills or other pole weapons, then get posting down below. Cheers for watching. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.